Good afternoon and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for the District of Squamish for May 21st, 2019. Welcome Squalin, Quisqueneqpigut, Squamish, Awayame. Welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. I am Councillor Doug Race and I am the acting mayor this month, and as such will be chairing this Committee of the Whole meeting. We have, first of all, a rather short agenda, long but short on items. And is there a mover for the adoption of the agenda? Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Herford. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. One item on the agenda, Sea to Sky Multimodal Evacuation Plan. Over to Ms. Latimer.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor and Council. My name is Megan Latimer. I'm the Emergency Program Coordinator for the District of Squamish. And I'm here today to present to you on Sea to Sky Multimodal Evacuation Plan. I have with me also here today Roy Simons from ISL Engineering. They were our consultant on this project. The project was also a joint initiative with the Resort Municipality of Whistler. It was shared 50-50 with them in terms of the resources. We also have Bill Stoner, Fire Chief for District of Squamish, and Kara Triance, Head of RCMP for the corridor. They were members of the steering committee for this project as well. So the evacuation plan really began about a year and a half ago, and we started looking at this so that we could understand how the entire community of Squamish or Resort Municipality Whistler would safely evacuate in an emergency. And we started looking at this following the mass evacuations in Fort McMurray over in Alberta, as well as here in BC in places like Williams Lake, where those were very reactive situations, and we wanted to have a more proactive understanding of how we would actually enact a mass evacuation. We also wanted to understand the different opportunities and limitations of our transportation infrastructure in an evacuation situation, as well as to estimate the amount of time it would actually take to evacuate Squamish under various conditions. So the evacuation plan, it actually consists of three different components. There's the guidance document, which you have with you today, and this is really the strategic framework for the evacuation plan. It outlines the different strategies and processes that we would use to actually enact evacuation. There's also two other components. There's the operational evacuation plan, and this is an internal document which has the sort of step-by-step instructions for district staff as well as other agencies that would be involved in evacuation. How they would actually enact those activities. And finally, there's also a GIS map that is part of this project, which outlines all of the different resources for evacuation operations so that we can really visualize some of the key spatial information that we need for an evacuation. The evacuation plan was overseen by a steering committee of 15 members. Because evacuation is a multi-jurisdictional process, we decided to involve them from the beginning so that we could understand what everybody's role and responsibility would be in an evacuation. There are representatives from different local governments within the corridor, from First Nations, from various provincial ministries that have a strong role in evacuation, RCMP, fire rescue, as well as some other public and private sector entities. We met quite regularly with the evacuation committee, the steering committee, to validate some of the processes that are described in the document and to make sure that we captured the roles and responsibilities of everybody who'd be involved in the process. The evacuation plan itself was sort of divided into two different phases. We had a research or sort of mini assessment phase, which was the start of the process. And then we actually had the plan development, which was the second phase of the evacuation planning. And during the during the research phase, we reviewed best practices from other cities who are used to enacting evacuation. So we looked in particular down in New Zealand, at some of the cities down there, as well as in the US, cities that are used to doing evacuations due to hurricanes, to understand some of the best practices from those places. We also reviewed the after-action reports from Williams Lake, Caribou Regional District, as well as other places that have enacted mass evacuations here in Canada to understand some of the lessons learned from those communities. And we looked at best practices in general for evacuation as outlined by the province and as outlined by our federal government. And with this, we were able to then start to look more in depth at some of the hazards that would actually cause an evacuation here in Squamish. We'll take a bit of a closer look at that in a minute. We also developed community profiles to understand who would be evacuating, what kind of resources are available for that. And then we also conducted a very comprehensive analysis of the capacity and constraints of the highway, of Highway 99, as well as alternative modes of transportation that could be used for an evacuation. And in a minute, Roy's going to talk a little bit more about the findings for Highway 99. And with all of this information, we then were able to develop the plan itself. And the plan itself outlines different options for travel. It outlines different strategies for evacuation to make it more efficient. And also it outlines in detail the decision-making process around evacuation, some of the tools that can be used for decision makers like yourselves in terms of ordering an actual evacuation and when that process should be enacted. The concept of operations for evacuation is also detailed in the document. How the public would get information on an evacuation situation, where they would find that, and what kind of messaging we would give to them is also detailed in the document, as well as things like mass shelter options. So once people were evacuated from the community, where they would go and what kind of resources are on the other end. When we reviewed the different hazards that could cause a mass evacuation in Squamish, we looked at our community risk assessment report, which was conducted back in 2015. And in that report, there's about 30 plus hazards here within the community of Squamish, but we narrowed it down to which ones could actually cause a mass evacuation. So the document itself is considered all hazards, so all of the processes and tools outlined in the document could be used for any type of hazard affecting Squamish. However, we did really want to understand better which types of hazards would cause a no-notice situation of evacuation, where it would happen very suddenly, we would have to evacuate the community immediately, or where we'd have a bit of advance notice, where we would have more time to actually put in place the resources and planning that are outlined in this document. So for Squamish, we really focused quite heavily on flood-related hazards. So flooding, debris flow, failure of the dam, barrier collapse. We also considered wildfire, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, loss of essential services or critical infrastructure. So this would be water, electricity, or sewage over a number of days. As well as 2 human-caused hazards, so hazardous materials release, as well as terrorism. And for Whistler, their main concern was wildfire, whereas ours was more flood-related. The next step that we did during the research phase was we built up community profiles to better understand what the maximum number of people would be that would be evacuating, what the maximum number of vehicles that would be on a highway would be on the highway during evacuation, what the potential demand for transit services would be. So for people who don't have access to a vehicle, how many buses would we be needing to bring in to evacuate people who don't have cars or rely on transit during evacuation? Where people would be going once they were evacuating, how many people would require assistance to evacuate because of physical disabilities or health issues or other vulnerabilities. How many people might require shelter was another consideration. And to build up this picture, we looked at a number of different sources. We consulted census information, BC housing assessment data, tourism data from both communities, information from ICBC, and a number of other sources. So try to build up a profile. And for Squamish, the profile we selected to test with our evacuation modeling was looking at what the maximum population would be within the corridor on a certain day. So we chose a weekend day during the summer where we'd be looking at having the full residential population within the community, as well as a high number of visitors to the community. So this sort of worst case scenario modeling. We're looking at 27,600 people and about 14,000 vehicles that would be evacuating on the highway. We also, through this analysis, identified about 400 people who would require assistance with evacuation. We suspect there's actually more, but this would be part of vulnerability assessments in the future. And we also identified that there'd be somewhere almost 5,000 people who would probably require group lodging or accommodation if they were evacuated from the community that might not have somewhere to go. There's another scenario that we considered when we were building up the community profiles, and it's quite unique to Squamish. So we have a high number of people who commute down to the city or up to Whistler during the day. So we also looked at a peak summer day during Monday to Friday during business hours. And the reason we considered this is because although there'd be fewer people in the community to evacuate, there would also be fewer vehicles available. And this has an impact on our actual evacuation planning in terms of what resources we'd require to evacuate people out of the community. So we'd be needing more buses to take out people who didn't have access to vehicles. So we're looking at about 2,000 people without access to vehicles in that scenario. Whereas under a weekend scenario, it's about 350 people were identified as being carless. Once we built up the community profiles...
Just a second, where are you? So at this point, excuse me if I can just interject, I think we want to try to get through the presentation, but if there's questions or clarification, by all means.
Just quickly on that, the number of people who require evacuation assistance in that scenario, it's very possible that both parents are in the city and there are children here. So did we contemplate the number of children that would need to be evacuated that may not have a parent in town?
Yes, so part of our analysis was reaching out to the daycares to understand the number of children who are within daycare facilities and what assistance they would need, because the daycare facilities would actually be responsible for those children while the parents are in the city.
What about schools?
And schools as well. So we work closely with School District 48 to understand as well what their needs would be and what sort of planning they have in place for that. So that will be a continued process in the future, because with the operational evacuation plan, a lot of those considerations will live there in terms of the actual step-by-step process for what kind of assistance those facilities would need, as well as the reunification with parents who are down in the city or up in Whistler and their children are still in Squamish. So the next part of the research phase was looking at the transportation options for evacuation. We really wanted to understand the capacities and the options for use within the corridor of all of our transportation options. So we looked at road assets, so Highway 99, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. We looked at alternate roads, just for service roads as assets. We identified the corridor trail here in Squamish and the Valley Trail up in Whistler as potential assets for evacuation. We looked at air assets, so we looked at the Squamish and Pemberton airports to better understand their runway capacity, what kind of airplanes could come, what kind of air assets could come in and out of those airports. We reached out to the Department of National Defense as well as commercial providers to understand who is using those airports currently and who could use those airports. We also charted where the different heliports and helicopter landing areas are within the corridor. And we also looked at, I think that's something else actually, we also looked at marine assets. So we looked at floatplane docks, what kind of aircraft would be coming in here in Squamish regularly, and as well as the emergency ferry docks at Porto Cove and Darrow Bay. We worked closely with Squamish terminals to understand the capacity of the port there. We also worked very closely with CN Rail to understand the use of the railway tracks and what that process would look like. And so through our analysis, we understood that Highway 99, it still has the most significant capacity for evacuation. This is going to be the main means of travel for people to evacuate. And to better understand the different opportunities and limitations of the highway, we contracted ISL Engineering to do some traffic modeling and analysis for us of the highway itself. So we have Roy Simons here, who is the Manager of Transportation Planning for ISL. And he's going to provide a summary of the traffic analysis that he's done.
Okay, thanks, Megan. So I guess there was three primary purposes of our piece of of the work. The first, and I guess most important, being to simulate an actual evacuation in the scenarios that we developed. So the software we used for that is a piece of software called Vism, which is industry standard traffic modeling software, and it's hard to see on the image there, but basically the entire network between Pemberton and Horseshoe Bay is modeled in pretty explicit detail. Every travel lane, merge, intersection is modeled in there. All the vehicles are unique entities within the model and have their own driver behavior and car following model. So it's as close to modeling an evacuation as we can without an actual evacuation occurring and observing how that works. So that was the first purpose, to model it in as high a level of detail as we possibly could. Second purpose is to inform people like yourselves who have to make that call in terms of ordering an evacuation. So we want to give you the comfort that there's been technical analysis completed and you understand how long it would take to get everybody out of town. And then the third being is to provide some insights into the challenges that might happen for people like Megan here or Bill, in terms of how we might need to place people at strategic locations to better control traffic. So that's kind of the three primary purposes. So in terms of the issues that we found in terms of evacuating from Squamish, so from each of the neighbourhoods, obviously people need to get to the highway is the only way out. Squamish is quite different from Whistler because most of the intersections are signal controlled, so even if the highway is pretty jammed up, each of the minor roads do get an almost equal opportunity to access the highway. And in Whistler, there's a lot of stop controlled intersections which don't have priority over the highway, and that was a big challenge there, which we don't have here. Once you get onto the highway going south, so depending on which neighbourhood you're evacuating from, there might be a series of traffic signals through town. Obviously, once you get out of town, there's lane merges from 2 to 1. And the biggest challenge going south, obviously, is definitely like Porto Cove. The highway is down to 2 lanes. There's a railway, there's the rock face there. There's very little scope to widen it to create 2 lanes south all the way. So a lot of our work focused on phasing the evacuation at a level that the 1 lane south could handle, rather than creating excessive congestion, which would create panic in the public and lead to longer travel times. Going north, it's kind of the same issue. There's traffic signals leaving town depending on which neighbourhood you're coming out of, and again there's lane merges from 2 to 1 lane. For Whistler, we've actually looked at reversing some of the lanes so that there would be 2 lanes all the way south to Squamish, and we're about to do that here for the district with 2 lanes going northbound. The challenge there being that once you get into Whistler, it's down to 1 lane again, so it might let you get out of the immediate area a lot quicker, but then it's going to back up down the highway. So there was 3 scenarios that we assessed for Squamish. So they were all peak day, so the same traffic volumes. One was all traffic south, one was all traffic north, and then the other one was split north and south at the Mamquam River. So in terms of neighbourhood evacuation times, so this is for individual neighbourhoods. So for an evacuation where everybody's going south, for example, everybody on the east side of the highway has to make a left turn. Typically that results in longer evacuation times. The right turn is typically a yield turn. And there's traffic signals obviously stopping the north-south flow. We left the traffic signals operating in their current configurations. The evacuation was modelled over 24 hours. For specific evacuations, you might bring in traffic control personnel to adjust how people get in and out certain neighbourhoods depending on the precise evacuation scenario. So the evacuation times from neighbourhood and the town as a whole are obviously subject to a few things. How it's phased. So ideally we want to phase it as long as possible so that there's less congestion on the highway and it's a less stressful evacuation for everybody. It also depends on the population we're evacuating. We assume the entire population, but it's quite possible there would be just certain neighbourhoods. Again, whether there's a left or right turn from the highway. So if the graph's kind of hard to understand, but we have each of the neighbourhoods there. You'll see, for example, Mamquam Road westbound, so that's everybody on the east side of the highway, has one of the largest evacuation times. And that's because there's a large population up there. They're all making a left turn onto the highway, which is kind of capacity constrained in its normal operating configuration. So that was the worst case, about 8 or 9 hours for that scenario. And that's assuming all the other neighbourhoods are evacuating as well. If that neighbourhood was deemed to be the most at threat, you would maybe evacuate that first, hold the highway back or other neighbourhoods back to get everybody out quicker, and you'd have traffic control at the signals. So in terms of the big numbers, the peak day phased northbound was 15 hours total evacuation time. Peak day phased southbound was 13 hours, and then when we split that, it was about 7 and 6 hours. So that's telling you, you need at least that much time to go on evacuation if you're trying to get everybody out of town. Ideally, you would have a bit more than that as well to make it a bit more comfortable. So in terms of the general guidance that came out of our analysis, so where possible, obviously anticipate in advance and call the order early enough to avoid driver frustration and panic. That's also particularly important where in Squamish we're most concerned about flooding, and certain roadways may be blocked off due to flooding, so we want to get people out before that happens. Where a sudden threat occurs, evacuate those most at risk first, just as I was saying, if there's specific neighbourhoods. Understand that there's a lot of growth in town, so as the population increases, those evacuation times will also increase. And also just that every evacuation will be different. We've modelled 3 pretty unique scenarios, but the chances of it playing out like that are unlikely, and there will be some kind of variation there. Part of it, like this neighbourhood, that neighbourhood, you've got to use this to kind of make the call on the fly kind of thing. I think that's all I have for you. Thanks, Megan.
So once we better understood the capacity of the highway, we started to look at the actual physical transportation of people out of the community and how they use the infrastructure that we have to actually leave. So we assumed that most people would be evacuating using their personal vehicles. It's very important that when they are evacuating that we're asking them to only take one vehicle, not both, just to reduce that congestion on the highway. And also that we're asking them to take extra people who might not have access to a vehicle, or both of those options. Because what we found when we were doing our analysis and building up the profiles is that there are actually enough vehicles in Squamish to take the entire community out. There's actually enough seat belts and seats within cars, but it's not equally distributed across the population. So there will be some messaging that will need to be done in terms of encouraging people to reach out to their friends, their neighbors, to make sure that people who don't have a vehicle have a ride out of the community. We also looked in detail about how we would be using transit assets, so buses, shuttles, Squamish Connector. We reached out to School District 48 to understand how many school buses we have here in Squamish, as well as up in Whistler, how many seats, seat belts, also which types of transit assets could evacuate people with wheelchairs. And so the concept of operations for transit would be, again, to assist people who don't have access to a vehicle necessarily. We'd be asking them to, in a no-notice situation where it was very urgent, we'd be asking people to assemble at central muster points and then using transit assets to transport them out of the community to safety. If we did have an advance notice situation over a few days, we'd probably be using regular transit routes to go and pick people up. And then to transfer them to central muster points and out of the community that way. One of the interesting concepts that we examined in detail was carpooling or ride sharing. In other evacuation situations in other communities, this has happened sort of organically, so people being picked up on the side of the road by Good Samaritans or by friends and family. We wanted to look at both the messaging around that, but also looking at companies like Pop a Ride, which already exist, are well established here in the corridor, and connecting drivers with people who need rides, and so how we would take over that platform and work with them to actually be able to move people out. So picking people up again at central muster points and taking them out of the community using private vehicles. In terms of the use of our air assets, so our airports and helicopter landing sites, this was a little bit more limited in terms of taking high volumes of people out. There are Department of National Defense aircraft that can come in and take a certain number of people, so in the 20s and 30s out, but we didn't think this was necessarily feasible for moving high volumes of people out. So we'd probably be looking at dedicating this for people who have complex medical needs, need to be evacuated from the hospital, and dedicating the airport for that, as well as for bringing in assets, so bringing in people, resources, staffing for RCMP, for other agencies, and equipment, and for bringing that into the corridor. In terms of marine, we worked very closely with BC Ferries to understand what kind of boats could be brought into Porto Cove and Darrell Bay. So it looks like a ferry the size of Queen Coquitlam, which is the ferry that operates between Horseshoe Bay and the island, could be brought in. And the concept of operations around the use of ferries, although they could take vehicles, we actually decided it would be better to use this to take out walk-on passengers. We would take out a higher number of people, and also the access to those ferry docks would very quickly back up the highway in terms of the vehicles waiting to get onto the ferries. So we look at using buses or transit assets to drop walk-on passengers off at the ferry and cycle those buses back through the community to pick up more people, should that be necessary. As I mentioned before, we work closely with Squamish terminals to understand what kind of ships could be brought in there. Most of those are more industrial options, so cargo ships, which are not necessarily well set up for transporting people out. They don't have enough life jackets or the infrastructure for that. However, it is possible to bring a cruise ship into Squamish terminals. That was done back in 2010 during the Olympics for staff housing, I believe. We also identified the Royal Canadian Marine Search and Rescue as an asset for transporting people. Again, not large numbers of people, but probably key personnel, bringing them in and out. And here in Squamish, we have an RCMSR station. Unfortunately, their boat, as of this week, has been impacted with engine failure. However, there are also stations down in North Vancouver as well that provide assistance. We had some very interesting conversations with CN Rail about the use of rail assets in an emergency evacuation situation. CN actually owns the tracks, however they don't have passenger trains for actually evacuating people. So they encourage us to reach out to other providers of passenger rail. So we made contact with TransLink, who owns West Coast Express, so they're in Vancouver, and so it is possible to bring West Coast Express train assets up into the corridor, should that be necessary. We also spoke in depth with the West Coast Rail and Heritage Museum here in Squamish, and they have 5 passenger rail cars which could be used in emergency, which are kept up to spec. Normally they just use them for tourism, for Thomas the Tank Engine and the Polar Express, but those could be used to actually transport people out, should it be necessary. And in the document, we identified a number of different evacuation strategies to try to make the evacuation process more efficient. So these included evacuation zones, central muster points, and the use of different traffic management strategies. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of those now. Evacuation zones, this is a concept, it's not new. However, it's something that we think would be very useful in an evacuation situation. And in many cities or municipalities, evacuation zones are actually delineated using codes or sort of separate numbering systems. And here in Squamish and up in Whistler, we decided to stick with the neighborhoods, the names of the neighborhoods that people already know, that they can identify with and already understand. So if we were to say that Ballycliffe was being affected in an evacuation situation, this is something people could already identify with and understand that it was affecting them. So we stuck with the neighborhood names, which are also in the official community plan, just for consistency. And this will be one of the things that will be really pushing to the public, is to understand their evacuation zone and which neighborhood they live in, so that should mayor and council order an evacuation, that they understand what's on the map and which area is being affected. And we'll be detailing exactly which parts within the evacuation zone were being evacuated. The other evacuation strategy is the use of central muster points. So as I mentioned before, we'd be using these in particular for looking at the transportation of people without vehicles. So either transporting them to central muster points or encouraging them to get there in a no-no situation through walking or cycling. And using transit assets to evacuate them from central muster points to a safe point out of the community. We chose 15 for Squamish. We wouldn't necessarily use all of these in an emergency situation. We would be communicating that to the public. In particular, in a flooding situation, some of these might not be accessible. But we've chosen institutions which are familiar to the public. So most of them are public institutions like schools. And we've also chosen them for their proximity to neighborhoods, so that people aren't having to walk a long way to access those points. There are also in the document a number of different traffic management strategies that are outlined. There's a few that I'll touch on here. We talked already about evacuation phasing and the importance of this in terms of having a more efficient evacuation, making sure that we are phasing the neighborhoods that need to get out first because the hazard is closest to them or the threat is closest to them. Linked with that would be the use probably of traffic control to actually coordinate that on the ground at the site level, of communicating back with the Emergency Operations Center and with the policy group about the progress of the evacuation. Of once one neighborhood is fully evacuated, we can start with other neighborhoods and to make the process more efficient. We also looked at evacuation lane reconfiguration of Highway 99. This is still in progress, looking at the northbound option. Between Whistler and Squamish, we've tested the southbound option of actually having 2 lanes coming south. This increases the number of vehicles, obviously, that are able to exit the community, and because the 2 lanes continue for quite some way past Squamish as well, this is seen to be much more efficient for Whistler coming south to Squamish. It shaved about 5 hours off their overall evacuation time. That being said, it does also require 5 hours to set it up with Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. So in an advance notice situation, this is a very useful tool because we could be planning to put that together. If we wanted to call an evacuation first thing in the morning, the crews could be working overnight to actually put that infrastructure in place. We're still testing for the northbound, as Roy mentioned, just because once you get to Whistler Village, it does narrow down only to 2 lanes, so that could create a bottleneck back to the community, which could create an unsafe condition. Destination assignment is another strategy that we looked at. This is a little bit of a last resort strategy. This is where we'd be telling people to go north or south. This is something that was used quite extensively in Fort McMurray. The reason we would like to avoid this is because when people are moving out of the community, we're hoping that they are going to somewhere that they have friends and family that they can stay with. And so preventing them from going one direction or the other impacts this, and we would have to look at providing accommodation for them. So the more we can let people choose where to go, the better, so that they have somewhere to stay on the other end. We also looked at signal time modifications. The control center for this is down in Lower Mainland. We looked at the impact of work zones on the highway in evacuation and construction. So Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure assures us that should we be calling evacuation, they would be clearing the highway as quickly as possible, any construction crews or things that are in the way. And we also looked at the use of highway signage, so both stationary signs that we'd be bringing out, but also the electronic signboards to be able to communicate to the public as they're evacuated. The document also outlines in detail the entire evacuation process, and this is, I think, in particular useful for decision makers like yourselves in terms of understanding the different stages of this and where information is coming in. A couple of those steps I'll touch on more detail. One is the actual recommendation to evacuate, where that's coming from. So we receive recommendations both from district departments. So in the case of flooding, we would be receiving a recommendation from our Public Works Department with information from the Provincial River Forecast Centre. But for other types of emergencies, such as wildfire, we'd be receiving recommendation from BC Wildfire Service. So we decided to actually go through and chart out where those recommendations would be coming from, so that it's better understood what that information is, what the validity is of it, and who the lead agency is, so that you can understand where that information is coming from. The document also has a number of different tools in it for decision making. So this is just an example here of protective action decision tree. Of how you would get to the point of ordering an evacuation alert, or evacuation order, or potentially a shelter-in-place notice. There's also example timelines for evacuation clearance, and this is really what I think we want to underline by the proactive nature of the document. So instead of waiting until we're at the point where we have to order an evacuation and we haven't been able to pre-position resources, this is really encouraging us to take a step back from that and to understand the entire timeline behind an evacuation. So working backwards from when the actual threat impacts the community and when last people need to be out, which would ideally be several hours before the threat is actually impacting the community, going back to when we would have to order an evacuation. Prior to that, the different resources we want to have in place, such as extra fuel, such as tow trucks to assist the vehicles that get stuck on the highway, be blocking things. Going beyond that to, if we have the time, issuing evacuation alerts so that people are able to get ready to prepare their grab-and-go bags, their emergency kits, and all the way back to when we would be starting to monitor the hazard. So it's sort of a backwards process, but it's to underline that evacuation is not just from when we decide to put an evacuation order in place. There's actually several hours and ideally days before that we should be considering all of those things that would go into an evacuation. The document also talks about how the public would be getting information during evacuation, so where the credible sources are, so through the district channels, through our website, social media, through our emergency notification system, Squamish Alert, through use of local media, so Mountain FM, as well as some television broadcasts. If we had to door-to-door notification, using district staff to go and actually inform people about when to evacuate if there was time. The actual written documents, which are coming from the policy group, the mayor and council, the actual evacuation alerts and orders, and what those look like. The setup of a public information call center so people can call in particular if they need assistance to evacuate. This is where they can call in information in order to register themselves as needing assistance, as well as outlining media briefings and who will be responsible for that. And I'll just end here. These are the key messages we really wanted to stress with the public. And these are to have an emergency plan and a kit in place. So understand what your family's emergency plan is. If your kids are at daycare and you work in the city, who is someone that can go and pick them up, or how is your daycare provider actually going to link up with the district to understand what they need to do in an emergency. For people to stay informed and know where and how to get information, so the sources I mentioned earlier. For people to know what their evacuation zone is, and to know the location of their closest central muster points. For in an evacuation to be following the instructions of emergency officials. As well, if people have a vehicle, they're keeping their fuel tank topped up to at least half, especially wildfire season, this is quite important. If people don't have a vehicle, making a plan ahead of time, connecting with family and friends who do have a vehicle and give them a ride out of town. If people do require assistance to evacuate, making a plan around that in advance and what kind of needs they might have. And finally, if people have pets, putting in place planning for that, in particular if they have to go and stay in an emergency shelter. So I will end up there, and thank you very much. And we would like to request that Council endorses the Sea to Sky Multimodal application.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if there are any questions of council on this. What I'm going to do is go around the table, save me making a list, starting with the Mayor, Anderson, Hereford, Pettengill, French, and then I'll put myself in the list. Try to confine it to one question per go-round. Don't worry about putting your hand up for a second shot. I'll come to you in order. And if you don't happen to have a question handy, we'll just skip over you and go back around. We'll do that as long as time permits. So I'll start off with Mariella.
Thanks. I noticed that there were 7 scenarios that were mapped out for Whistler, and we did 3, and none of our 3 are a sudden evacuation. They're all planned, which I'm wondering why.
So yes, excellent question. There's a few reasons behind that. So one of the primary reasons is Whistler's population fluctuates seasonally a lot more than Squamish's does. So they had to take into account their summer population and their winter population and the very high spikes in both. And that has quite an impact in terms of the traffic modeling component and the number of vehicles that would be in the community at one time. Whereas with Squamish, we are somewhat more static. We have a more static residential population base. The other reason behind it was a little bit to do with the types of hazards we were considering. So for Squamish, with the flooding situation, we were imagining that we would have more time, more of an advancement situation to actually be able to put in place the evacuation phasing. Whereas with a no-notice situation, that may not be possible. With the learnings of Whistler's modeling of the no-notice evacuation scenario, we did understand that it would actually be faster to do no-notice evacuation overall. However, at the individual level, you would end up waiting in your car for a much longer period of time. And it also puts at risk those neighborhoods that are actually closer to the threat. So it's a little bit of a sort of hard concept, but with the phased evacuation, it takes a little bit longer. However, it is much safer overall, and your individual waiting time is much shorter. The reason we didn't model it for Squamish is because with the learnings of what was modeling Whistler around that, we were able to sort of apply that to the Squamish concept. That makes sense.
Do I get more than one or just one at a time?
One at a time. That's right.
I noticed on page 3 where the purpose and vision of the plan are laid out. One thing I might have thought to see there was identifying facility or infrastructure needs and gaps. Throughout the report, there's, if you read between the lines at least, there's lots of places where that is indicated, where there's need or opportunity for improvement. Now, will that job of identifying gaps and potential for improvement fall to your operational document? Is that what we might assume?
I don't think it would be in the operational document, just because that's more about the actual processes, the step-by-step processes. It has the phone numbers and the contacts for actually enacting those processes. So that's more of an internal working document. I do think that potentially be looking at investigating some of those gaps and making a separate plan with recommendation to put forward to council in terms of what we would still need to better enact the evacuation.
Thank you.
Councilor Herbert.
Thank you. Thank you for your work on this. As I was reading through the scenarios, it's amazing to work in that space for us for what we're thinking about all the time. It's good. But I was interested, and along the same lines as Councillor Anderson, where there are those the highways identified as the main way to move people, and particularly the data about the pinch point at in Britannia, that number was striking to me. And how does that get related down the line as far as for future projects, which just to sort of pick out one of the pieces that I think Councillor Anderson was alluding to. As far as I'm assuming the teams at the table during this as well. So.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'll let Roy turn in a second. But I mean, when we looked at this plan, we were really working with our existing infrastructure and looking at it from an emergency lens. The plan itself, as I mentioned before, it doesn't outline recommendations for future infrastructure changes. That is honestly a possibility. It might improve some of those blockages. I'll let Roy chime in as well.
Yeah, no, I think you summarised it pretty well. Removing that pinch point at Portapo, for example, would be a massive undertaking, millions and millions of dollars. So we weren't, it was kind of out of scope to look at that. Yes, we identified it as a pinch point, and in theory, with unlimited money, you can overcome that, but really we're trying to come up with an evacuation plan that can be managed around the existing infrastructure. I would say that if there's more minor tweaks, for example in Whistler, making the left turn out of Lorimer Road a double left turn would help get people southbound there with relatively low cost. So there's little things like that. This would be a massive project.
Councillor Penfield.
Just wondering, there's a little bit about the receiving communities, but I can imagine, personally, my family, I'd want to get off at Horseshoe Bay, basically off the highway there, and I think probably a lot of people might be their inclination to go to Park Royal and wait it out or something. And so, what sort of planning or communications will we have with receiving communities to make sure they're ready for an influx of 20,000, 30,000 people all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we've worked very closely with our counterparts in emergency management down in West Vancouver and North Vancouver through the North Shore Emergency Management Office. That would be one of our main receiving areas. So to better understand what they have in place for reception centers, how we will be connecting with them to share information, because obviously once our community gets there, they're going to want information about what's happening back home. So that's a really important part of, I would say, the operational plan in terms of the connections with them, the messaging, the phone numbers of who would be needing to get information, be informed in advance as well, that we're sending 20,000 people south. We need to have reception centers ready to provide people with information. So those connections are quite strong with North Shore, and then also looking north. We've been working, if we were sending people up to Whistler or beyond to Pemberton, or even further down the corridor, working with the emergency operations centers up there and with their registration and referrals teams up there to make sure that we're ready to receive our communities.
Councillor French.
Thank you. Great work. I can see hours and hours were dedicated to this. It's a good thing that we had good people on it. I don't remember seeing anything in the report about revisiting this as things change, like years down the road. Do you have any thoughts on when we should dust this off again? Assuming 5 years from now we haven't had any major emergencies, and review it and see what needs to be adjusted.
To the mayor. Excellent question. So we really see this as a living document. And I think what we've realized through the process over the last year is that this is really just the beginning. This is sort of our baseline for evacuation planning. And as new information becomes available, both in terms of hazards on the one hand, but also as our community grows in terms of population, in terms of development, these are things that we can then put back into our traffic modeling, but also into our other planning that's within the document. So right now we set it to update every 2 years, but that could also be done with the smaller changes on a regular basis, I think, as information becomes available. Because I think what we want to avoid is having to create a whole new plan in the future. We want to work with this one and to expand it, to bring new information into it. Because there are so many agencies that have already fed into this. And so we captured all of those processes, which was an interesting job to try to line all of those up and to understand who was doing what, when, and where. And so as much as possible, we'd like to feed into this plan and to grow it.
When I read this, I guess the concern I was left with was Highway 99, and particularly going southbound. And I thought about the Olympics, where there's a condition of the Olympic bid that there be 2 lanes going north in the morning and south in the afternoon, and that was done with coning. And why we couldn't look at something like that southbound. And I recognized the pinch point at Porteau, but my recollection is, although I personally didn't see it, is that they got permission to pave a portion of the CN tracks to add an extra lane for the Olympics. And if CN was in a cooperative mood, could we do that today, for example? Cost less than taking away the whole bluff. I know that's about $125 million, but just to pave the tracks and create that lane, and then of course fence it off, so that we actually had that, because that to me was the real problem. I mean, I think we all know the highway plugs up now on a ski afternoon, on a Sunday afternoon at various pinch points, and we're not going to evacuate very quickly at that rate. And the other possibility was using the FSR road that goes from Furry Creek through the watershed, and improving that. It's a long story that I won't go into now, but there was I ended up flying over at one time when the valley was full of people and they could have emptied it, but chose not to. But in an emergency, things like that to get rid of that pinch point, because it seems like the pinch point, and I know we're not here to make changes, but I'll leave you with those comments. And getting the permission now is certainly less money, and maybe the time to do it so that it is available if there was ever some real need to get a lot of people down Highway 99 soon. So I don't expect an answer back. Well, it's both. Mary Elliott, go ahead.
I'm going to follow
With a
up.
question or a comment.
There were a lot of comments about CN in here, and in fact, having West Coast Express or the Railway Heritage assets used would be very helpful to get quite a few people off the highway and onto the tracks. But it says, if EMB is successful in gaining approval to use CN rail tracks, and if the limitations could be overcome, and so CN is kind of classically difficult to work with, and so are we pursuing an agreement with them in advance? Because not only using the rails would get some of our heritage assets out of town where they would be safe, but we'd be able to move a lot of people much more efficiently using rail assets. So is CN getting in our way? Is EMBC going to pursue an agreement with them in advance, or do we have to pursue that? Because I don't like this if, maybe, we'll see what we can do. That's basically the tone of this report, is CN went, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, so it's been an ongoing process with CN. We spoke with them early on and identified this as an excellent option for moving a large number of people out, as well as people with pets or people with
People with disability issues,
exactly.
just tons of options here.
Yeah, so we identified that as being a very positive option. When we discussed with CN, they were not willing to enter into an agreement directly with local governments just because they foresaw it would be with multiple local governments. They preferred that we elevated it to the province, which we did. So our CAOs for both Whistler and for Squamish wrote a letter to EMBC requesting that EMBC and the province actually pursue agreement with CN. That process is ongoing. So they've had an initial meeting to start discussing it. CN has said they will assist where possible, and it's being pursued by EMBC.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Anderson?
Referring to the vulnerability and constraints of our highway southbound that Academia Races referred to, it seems to me that marine options are critical for us to have a look at. I note that in the project steering committee and in the report itself, most of the kind of resource people that have been consulted are Squamish terminals, and of course they do manage important assets of various kinds, unique. However, most of our coastwise shipping is focused in the Mackinac Channel. and maybe it's just an observation or recommendation, I think that perhaps we might, it might be an idea to boost our liaison with folks in the channel. And in future, we may see more of a coordinating entity depending on the outcome of our marine action strategy. But I think this is critical because this is where all of our ferry, tug and barge, ferries of different scales. Of course, it has its challenges for access with our dredging situation, but nonetheless, there are a lot of experience there and facility options. There's 3 terminals which barges can use today. So I just wanted to pass that on, that maybe there is an opportunity to think about identifying for marine options ongoing somebody that or a group that can speak to maximum blind channel options.
To the mayor, we reached out to the Harbour Authority, and they were actually very helpful in charting some of those options, and we will actually be including those in the operational evacuation plan. So not in terms of the movement of large number of people, but actually in terms of the coordination of resources and personnel.
Councillor Herbert?
Thank you. I was on vacation and went through an evacuation through Squamish border. And before the evacuation happened, there was a lot of questions. Just before we knew it was going to be an evacuation, there were lots of signs around evacuation right this way, and I didn't see anything sort of to that effect here. Although perhaps that's the main threat. Or here we've got the laundry list of threats. So. Yeah, is there have you seen any pieces out as far as signage, and particularly as tourism is growing, these are on your list you had of things to know, it's very resident specific, and as that sort of focus changes, or I'm assuming in Whistler, a lot of people don't know where they are even in the scope, so how is that addressed, or where's that coming?
Yeah, it's a very important piece, and the public information side is going to be so critical with this document, and that's something, all of those key messages that I mentioned, but also targeting some of those key stakeholders, so businesses, the tourism industry, to make sure that those messages are getting out to our key audiences, that they're considering the different needs that the different groups in Squamish have as well, that we're making this plan accessible to everybody. That's going to be a really important part of the next few months is rolling that out. So we're working with our communications team here to look at how to best do that, and what kind of materials we should be producing, what sort of events we should be having to really work with the community to get the information out to them.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, I've got a few things, not time to cover them all. I guess School District 48 is mentioned. I think it's sort of one of the primary entities that has a sense of where the kids are, where they will be. But I think we have a number of kids in private schools and homeschooling and so on. So, what's our plan for those kids?
It's to the mayor. It's largely the same. So it's working with those institutions. So the Montessori and the Waldorf schools. So that on 2 sides. So on our side, on the emergency operations side and the district side, we understand where they are and what their needs are. But also on the flip side, so that they are starting to plan and make sure that they have things in place for taking care of kids that their parents are not in the community, of how they will reconnect them with an emergency contact, and what their responsibilities would be in evacuation as well. So there's a lot of outreach that will be happening on that side as well.
Councillor French?
No further questions.
When I looked at this and the highest threat or probability of threat for Squamish being flooding, it occurred to me that would really only threaten a portion of Squamish, which is the part of the floodplain unlikely to be farther up out of it. And so when I read the report, I didn't frankly read it line for line, but I went through most of it. I didn't see anything really sort of contained within Squamish. I mean, is this the plan that would guide us if we were, for example, evacuating Brackendale? Would we necessarily send them to West Vancouver or to Whistler, or would we just try to get them up above the water level? And how would we deal with them kind of internally? We've already actually had, in the time I've been in Squamish, a couple of those things on smaller scales, but if we were dealing with a larger scale, Is this the report that would govern it, or is there some other process?
I guess there's sort of two answers to that. One is that a lot of the processes that are in that report would be also applicable to a neighborhood evacuation to another part of Squamish, for example. It's really about getting people from point A to point B safely. The report, though, when we looked at the flooding hazard, we actually used the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan, which has a section that looks at the percentage of the population that would be affected, as well as the quantitative risk assessment that was recently done. And that actually was fed into our modeling when we looked at the number of people who would be affected. And it is, I believe, off the top of my head, I think it was 60% north of Mount Quam, 40% the population south. So it would be a mass evacuation, and probably a lot of those people would have to leave the community if they didn't have options to stay within Squamish, because that would be a very big impact on the rest of the community. It would need a lot of assistance.
I'm coming to your house.
That's okay, if there's a fire, I'm going to your house.
I have a comment and a question. So the comment is that our evacuation group doesn't include our communications person. And given that we have to compete with social media, I feel like right from the beginning, our communications person should be right at the get-go. So that's one comment. And then also external agencies on page 86, it talks about we'll advise these external agencies and not limited to, so I know we haven't listed everyone, but I believe we should list our not-for-profits because they look after our most vulnerable people. And I feel like we should spell that out, because what I learned from the mayors up north is that the most vulnerable people in their communities were even more vulnerable through an evacuation process. And so giving those organizations sort of a headline in this report that they have a very important role to play with us in terms of taking care of our most vulnerable citizens, I think should be sort of called out in that section. And then my question is around, how do we get to electronic registration? So I heard from the Red Cross that we shouldn't go too much further without enabling electronic registration for folks so that they can choose to evacuate north or south, and they can go to Alberta if they want, but we have a way of communicating with them rather than making them line up to register or get funds. Because that's some of the biggest bottlenecks they saw up north, was that it sort of forced people to go to Kamloops or go to Prince George to get the funding they needed or get the information they needed versus electronic registration, because so many of us have these now, and we could be in our cars driving out of town and registering about where we're going, and how do we get there, Megan? And some communities are doing this on their own because they don't want to wait for the province, and I'm just wondering what our thoughts are in that regard.
So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this plan. However, it is something that's very, very closely linked, I would say, because it's sort of the next step. Once people get to the safe point, what do they do then? So the province is developing a system that is being trialed right now in Prince George, Prince Rupert, and 2 other communities within BC for wildfire season. I've had a look at it, and it actually looks quite robust and quite easy to use. There are other options. If it is just about, ensuring we know people are safely out of the community and that they have somewhere to stay, that might be as simple as just creating a sort of check-in app or something that we could operate here at a local level while we wait for the provincial system to become available.
Do we have the resources for that? I mean, given we have a fire season coming and then a flood season hot on the heels of that, I mean, do we actually have the capability to do that?
We don't have something developed right now. We're looking at whether we can use our emergency notification system in some way, so people are already registering on there. Is there some way we can also look at registration once they're evacuated and timing in there? Is it a matter of just having a call center set up that people can call and documentation electronically set up, but so people can register? So we're looking at different options.
Councillor Anderson.
Yes, with respect to muster stations, I was curious along our, I used to call it the straight stretch. Sandman Hotel has been identified as a muster station location. I was curious as to why we might not choose Walmart instead, because of the larger parking lot and you have different access points that are more advantageous than the hotel. Is there a particular reason why you would choose a hotel over a Walmart?
To the mayor, so we looked, the criteria for the muster stations was a large open parking lot, as you mentioned, and also a place where buses could turn around easily. Having them a little bit off the highway can be useful for that, I think, to decrease the congestion. It's not to say that Walmart couldn't be used. Again, those are the places we identified in the plan. It doesn't preclude us from also identifying other places depending on what happens in the emergency situation, because every scenario is going to be a little bit different. So those are the ones we've chosen at this point. We can also go back and look at amending those and including other areas as well.
Councillor Everett.
I guess I think I'm down to comment at this point, but I like all the pieces of this, and I've definitely identified some holes. I want to make sure that we are able to leverage this as we're as we go forward and contemplate different pieces, so that the emergency preparedness is something that we're thinking about ongoing. Yeah, so I think it's great. Thank you so much for the work, and I hope we never need this thing. But I fear we might.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, just so a few things. The one, the mention of wood fiber stuck out to me a little bit at Darrell Bay, and just made me think about are the pieces we're missing, and that one, because it's sort of like, well, maybe they'll do some sort of dock, which maybe we could use in some way in the future, and it's sort of, if we're including things at that level, have we considered the impacts of, because we're talking about expanding our public transit and more bus depots, and so that gives us options there. And you know, I think wood fiber is probably more tied to a terrorist risk than other things here. So I'm just, have we got all the pieces, and are they at all sort of the appropriate or matching level, I guess? I'm not entirely sure if I fully understood the question, but I mean, we try to consider all of the pieces that would be the most feasible in terms of keeping people safe. So in terms of transporting people to another place, we don't want to just necessarily sort of drop them off somewhere where there's no resources or services on the other end. So for example, when we were looking at the Forest Service Road going down to Indian Arm, that's one option to get people away from a hazard, but once they're there, you would also need to bring in additional transit asset through boats to actually take them away from there. So we try to look at the most direct ways to keep the highest volume people safe. So use of wood fiber, the dock over there, yes, it's a possibility, but once they got there, it would be difficult to provide services over there as well. It could be a staging point for then moving them on to somewhere else, but then bringing in a secondary mode of transportation as well.
Were you talking about wood fiber, the site for wood fiber, or were you talking about the dock that they might put in Darrell Bay?
They might do docking, but we don't know if it would be suitable, and so just so many ifs there. And so if we're including that, I was wondering then why didn't we also talk about expanding a bus depot and some of the other things that are sort of in play as well?
Mayor, we focused on the existing infrastructure. So we could speculate on a lot of the different possibilities in other areas, and there are obviously places where it would also have a positive impact on the evacuation situation. However, we didn't necessarily put that in the plan because it depends on what other decisions we made.
I'd like to sell my question to the mayor. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
We'll talk terms later.
Okay, if a fire starts in the SLRD, like Area D, just outside of Squamish or just outside of Whistler, who activates their EOC? Because you described quite a large role for the municipalities, and then there's like a small role for the SLRD. But if the fire starts there, then where's the handoff? Are they in charge, and then we become in charge once it reaches a certain point, and we start to get fearful that we might have to evacuate? And I'm asking this question because I understand there's a bit of confusion up north. in the wildfires.
So yes, that's one of the things we looked at in the after action reports, in particular for the Canada Regional District. Here in the corridor, we have very strong coordination, I would say, between the different emergency programs. If a fire was to start in SLRD, they would activate their emergency operations center. We would probably, if it was close to Squamish boundaries or if it was Whistler, also activate our emergency operations center as well, potentially to prepare for the fire from migrating across jurisdictional boundaries, also in terms of evacuees coming out of those areas. It depends a lot on recommendations coming from your lead agency, so in this case BC Wildfire Service, so understanding where the hazard is going, where it's moving, where the wildfire is affecting. But we'd be really stressing strong coordination liaison between those emergency operations centers. So whether that's putting personnel in each other so that they're communicating back and forth and part of that information flow, so it's getting out to policy decision makers, or whether you'd be co-locating emergency operations centers, that would be in probably quite desperate circumstances. Usually we try to keep them separate and then have liaison personnel. Thank you.
So Council, I'm mindful of time. We are not butting into another meeting. So there is a staff recommendation to endorse this report. And I had a conversation with Ms. Latimer before the meeting, and so we really, at this point, don't have the opportunity to amend the report by resolution. It's either endorse it or not. But with the knowledge that suggestions and comments that came out of this meeting are part of the future consideration of the plan, because it is a dynamic document that will change practically from day to day in some cases. So it's never cast in stone. With that, is there anybody who would like to go ahead?
Why can't we amend it?
Well, if we do, it's already been endorsed by Whistler, for example. If we made changes or tried to make changes to this document, it would go back into the pot for the corridor.
If we only amended things related to our piece, like who's on our notification list or who's on our evacuation group team, that doesn't affect Whistler.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so to clarify, some of those, for in terms of, who's on our evacuation notification list, things like that, that will be in the operational plan, and those are actually two separate documents. There is one for Whistler and one for Squamish, just because the information will be community specific. For the strategic guidance document, that's the one that's shared between the two communities. So
that would my comments be reflected in the operational plan?
the ones that are, yes, the ones that were pertaining to the more specifics, the step-by-step process, those would be in the operation.
Okay.
Somebody would like to make a motion? Councillor French, staff recommendation. Is there a seconder? Councillor Herford. Any further comment? I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Council, that completes the business for today. I'm looking for a motion to terminate. Councillor Herford, second Councillor French. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.